Greetings. I'm Justin Rothshank, here to invite you to join me and more than 40 other potters from around the country for the 11th annual Michiana Pottery Tour on September 24 and 25. You'll find a list of all the participating potters, links to all our web stores for online shopping, a tour map, and more information at MichianaPotteryTour.com or on our Instagram page at Michiana Pottery Tour. I hope to see you there.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 434 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Rebecca Ickes Carra from the Maker's Playbook podcast. For a little more than a decade, she's been a professional photographer that's focused on weddings and portraiture. A few years back, after marrying a potter, she turned that business know-how into the podcast, The Maker's Playbook, where she interviews ceramic artists and other creatives about their business. In today's interview, we have a special format where we're interviewing each other back and forth. So in this first part of the interview, which I'm airing on my feed, I'm asking her more questions. And then for the second part of the interview, she interviews me more. And so we're playing that on her podcast feed, which will be available later this week. If you'd like to find out more information on Rebecca, you can go to makersplaybook.com. Before we get to that episode, I wanted to thank the folks that have donated to our podcast. We are listener supported, so I'd like to thank Carla Potter, Noelle Kaler, and Janet Helm for their contributions. If you'd like to get involved yourself, you can do so at the website. That's talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. You should introduce yourself, because we should explain to the listeners we're doing a double episode. So we're going to play this on both podcasts. So if you would introduce yourself, that'd be great.
And I have no idea how it's going to work. So it's going to be fantastic for everyone. My name is Rebecca Ickes Carra. For people who have only heard my voice, it might be because I host the Maker's Playbook podcast, which is all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. Because that has been what I've been doing for the last 12 years in photography specifically. And then 2 years ago, met and married a full-time production potter. And so then ceramics was always kind of my dirty hobby, right? That made it sound bad.
Your dirty secret. It was your dirty secret and your dirty hobby. This is
why I interview people instead of give answers. I'm like sweating over here now. Messy, muddy. Gosh, there's so many other words I could have used. Muddy hobby. The thing to get me off the computer after all this rambling about computers. And so I got accepted into an artist residency program, which is and he was working at the school that I went to. And so then he was not my teacher. Let's just clear the air there straight off the bat. But yeah, so then we met and have been digging into getting our studio off the ground and his work especially, and seeing all of the potters on Instagram and online and seeing, I was really only seeing one business model represented, right? I was seeing the presumably half Instagram influencer, half potter, who would have tens of thousands of followers, who would do these big shop updates that would sell out in a matter of minutes. And then they would have a week worth of packaging and shipping and rinse and repeat. And I was kind of wondering I've been self-employed for over a decade now. I can see some of the cracks in what I'm seeing on Instagram. How does this actually work? And That's how the podcast was born. It's because so we figure out how it works, for better or for worse. Sometimes it's the Debbie Downer podcast.
Well, it's a big, strong dose of reality, which I appreciate that. I mean, I feel like in my show, I'm often daydreaming with people. Like we're talking about aesthetics, we're talking about meaning, all these kind of esoteric things. And I like that in yours, you'll often back people up and be like, wait, go back and tell me exactly what you meant when you said X, Y, Z. And as a listener, I appreciate that because I'm like you. Like I see that oftentimes they're not telling you the most important part, namely the failures they've been through to get to the successful thing that looks so smooth and easy.
Or even the very pragmatic for me in terms of like, talking about before we officially started, I don't know, we were recording, so who knows if people will hear it or not, but like your wife's a professor. So how does that impact your healthcare? And therefore, do you factor that into your costs when you're working on selling your work? Or, getting some more of the what's the word? Not environmental details, but for lack of a better word, the outside world influence of like, what are they dealing with? Because it's a lot different to be self-employed living in Helena, Montana, and the cost of living there versus New York City. And how does that work? How are there potters in both of these places who are full-time or part-time or side hustling? I mean, we've got everybody in every phase, or at least I'm actively working on making sure we have people in every phase of business. There's people who are never planning to go full-time, who will always keep it a side hustle, and that's very intentional for them. And that's okay too. That doesn't make them any, I think there's, at least in photography, there was a lot of pressure behind like, oh, you're not legit until it's your only income or you're full-time. And I kind of call BS on that.
Yeah, totally. Because I feel like people that do jump off the sort of the cliff of like, this is going to be my full-time business, usually they have a golden safety net somewhere, whether that's another spouse, whether that's family inheritance. Sometimes that's that they live in an area with a really low cost of living. Like you mentioned Helena, and that's gotten more expensive throughout the pandemic. But I had interviewed a woman that bought a house in 1980, and I think it was $30,000.
The glory days.
Yeah, I mean, what the mortgage on $30,000, like that, most people have student loans that are more than that now. So what that gave her, and she didn't say this, this is what I'm interpreting after our interview, is that it gave her a really long runway that she could slowly build up the business and build up the business and build up the business before she had to actually launch. As to where if you're in Brooklyn and your rent is $3,000 a month, or Portland, or anywhere, that high rent makes that runway really steep. Like you got to get your business off the ground and up into the air and at least have your airplane stable within, 9 months or a year, as opposed to a decade before.
Yep. I'd say a year if you're lucky, like a year if you've got revenue support coming in elsewhere. And that's been the interesting conversation between having these discussions with people who are in varying stages of their careers, to look at like, the person I studied under for a bit of time when Francesco and I met was Sandy Lockwood, and she had gone and bought a plot of land outside of Sydney and had like effectively built herself a little lean-to, like tin roof. I'm not exaggerating. This is how she had told it to me. And has built on and built on and built on over the course of life and whatnot. But like, I don't know anywhere in the US you could reasonably do that. Okay, yes, incredibly remote, absolutely. But as far as just any of us trying to minimize our costs, we went from Chicago to Milwaukee for that purpose. But even still, each month kind of looking at budget, being like, my gosh, there's nothing else we can cut back on. Like, where else does it give? Like, we're not sitting on Netflix, Hulu, and Disney Plus subscriptions. I canceled all that stuff.
That's when your neighborhood library card comes in handy again.
Right. Anyways, we ramble. But I think I want, before we get away from it, I think it's also really important to have both of the conversations that we're having, to have the esoteric and the because at the end of the day, we're both interviewing people that are making things. And so you want to have some intention and passion behind what you make and why you make it. But at the same, I think both conversations are important for the working art world as a whole.
Especially because in academia, there's a lot of potters that get trained in academic environments, but they don't always have time to get this education. And that's one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about with the way that you, like, I think of you as a podcaster, but you're an educator about small business, and you approach your social media, at least from the outside, this is just an observation, that the posts you're making, they are bringing people into your community, which we'll talk about later, and other things, but you're educating them. Like, you don't make a bunch of random posts. Like, if someone reads your timeline chronologically on Instagram, they're going to learn some practical tips for photography, small business management, and community building. So how did you get to that point where you realized the education, because you're not necessarily a traditional educator, but you're taking an educational lens and putting that towards your own small business growth. So how did you get to that?
Well, first off, it just excites me that that's how you describe me and my Instagram, because I'm like, yay, I'm doing it right. Right? Because we all put out all of this stuff to the internet, and you're just kind of like, okay, like, fly away, little birdie, did it work? So that's exciting. But really and truly, it's just from my experience of the last 12 years. I did not go into starting my own business because that was the plan. I switched out of a music performance major into graphic design when I was an undergrad in the early 2000s, because that was the quote unquote safe art, right? Graphic design should have been the very secure, you go interview with whatever company, anybody from a financial law firm, crypto bros, down to, a nonprofit doing social justice work, and everybody in between needs design. And so that was, for me, the perceived like security blanket of like, oh, okay, well, I can do something creative and problem solve, but also have a 401k. Haha, spoiler alert. I graduated in 2009 and nobody was doing anything. And so really, I very accidentally started my business. So I hadn't like prepared during school to do that or anything. I had studied photography, but, not thinking about it from a business perspective, not thinking about it from being self-employed. And I think that's the case for many people, at least 30s and up. And so I'm 35. I had to think about that for a second. And I was like, hold on. I notice a lot of people now in their 20s and coming out of school are way more aware of this reality, or even people before they're going into higher education are considering, like, is it really worth taking on the debt of higher ed in the US and considering alternative paths. But, from my experience being unprepared for it, I started a business because I found myself going to a photography conference, first off, which was kind of happenstance. So the real, giving the answer I try to get out of people. Let me walk this back a little bit. I came home from living in England for a year in August of 2010 because I was going to photograph my cousin's wedding. I worked for a wedding photographer during college. Fabulous summer gig. Sure as heck beats retail. And so I did this wedding, but I did it on my own. And all of a sudden I realized, like, oh, I kind of like this if I'm in charge instead of the like bro I was working for. And so then that got me thinking. And so then I start kind of like testing the waters of it from my parents' dining room table. I'm like living with my mom and dad. I've just got off a year of full-time volunteer work. And so then I kind of like design a logo, and I'm like, I'm trying this thing, but I'm also trying to put in job applications for graphic design. So one of my good girlfriends had gotten married the spring before, and I knew from that like in 2010, everybody's putting their wedding photos, the photographers rather, are putting their photos into online galleries so that their couples get this link that goes out to family and friends. You can see your pictures, you can order your pictures yourself. So couples no longer have to, show grandma a proof book to pick her 8x10, and then they have to order it and all this stuff. This is a very long-winded answer. The point being, I picked the gallery company solely because it was the gallery company, the photographer that my friend had used for my cousin's wedding. And then from that, it just so happened that the gallery company I picked had a passion for community and hosted conferences. Like, this was none of my own forward thought. People listen to me talk now about critical thinking and being strategic and planning stuff out. Like, all of this started on accident.
Well, you were following your gut, though.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Well, let's give you credit in retrospect that you were having an intuitive moment and you were being led in that direction.
Somebody should have told my parents that in November of 2010, when all of a sudden I was like, by the way, I'm going to go to New Orleans to a conference for 3 or 4 days, whatever it was. And they were like, how? They talked me out of road tripping down there by myself because it's like a 24-hour drive from Illinois. And they were like, we'll help you pay for the flight, but let's talk about this. So I went to this conference, truly, and filled a notebook full of information. I mean, it's kind of like, I would assume for people in the pottery world going to NCECA for the first time, right? It's just like mind blown full of information. Met some fantastic people, some of whom are still dear friends of mine, people who became mentors, photographers who were even just 5 years ahead of me or 10 years ahead of me, who just answered the phone. Every time I had a question, send them a text, who do you use? What supplier do you use for this? What do you do for that? Those really, in some ways, simple questions, but when you've never done something before and you're just getting started, feel really overwhelming. And literally those relationships from that very first conference is what powered and continued a lot of the growth that I've had over the last 12 years. I can track back a lot of those business decisions to conversations with people that I met from that original community.
I always wonder that, like, how does who explains your field to you dictate how you function in the field? Because I think about this a lot with potters, like if your introduction to pottery as a living is the Instagram influencer, then you're going to rely on digital tools more than, say, my teacher's generation, which relied on postcard mailings and mailing lists and all these things that, the new digital world doesn't exactly lean on. So it's interesting that you found from one conference actual practical skills. I hope that people could go to an NCECA now and actually get something and get something enough to like start a business out of it, or at least get some connections that could help them once they start their business.
And I think the point you just made as far as connections is huge, because I think, yes, there's definitely quality education out there. And I haven't actually had a chance to go to NCECA yet, but I know they put a lot of effort into it, obviously, but, it's both and, right? Because there's been times as I grew in photography, I'd go back to those same conferences and I wasn't really going for the education anymore, right? Because at a certain point, if you are actively educating yourself, it's really starts to become really difficult to find anything new and find anything. This was one of my biggest challenges and complaints was, conferences, at least in the photography world, it was really easy to find those, like, let's call them 100 level, if it was up higher education, those 100 level classes, but it was getting really hard to find the 200 or 300 or 400 level classes, right? Because that market is smaller, but that's a different story entirely. But I think those connections are just as important. I think it's a both and for at least, or from my experience, that's what it was. Yeah. But the other thing that I think of when you mention like how much your education and the people who taught you influenced was also the examples that you see, right? Like if your only example of a working artist was going to university and there being someone who has their practice on the side of their teaching schedule, then the assumption is, in order to become a working artist, I have to get a master's so I can teach at the university level, and then I'll do my studio work in my spare time. As opposed to, the year I spent abroad was the first year ever that I was surrounded by working artists who didn't do anything else, or who did a few different random things, or, and also had families and had partners and had, it wasn't just the common American example, which is the spouse who's the, hedge fund broker or something, and the artist who gets to stay home.
Well, yeah, you bring up that it's an American example, and I think that's true. As I've traveled to other countries, and as you saw in the UK, like we have a pretty specific way to do things. The UK does too. Like their classic thing was the backyard potter with like the backyard potter shit. Like that's even like
I still think there's a business out there that's supplying these things. Like
builds those sheds.
I tried to get it out of Sophia and Cara when I talked to them on the podcast, and they're like, I'm like, there's a company, and if there's not, we gotta start it.
When I was down in New Zealand, I was doing a teaching tour, and they have clubs there, and there's this amazing facility structure that they have where it's like an art center we have, but you just pay a small fee. I think it was like $50 a year, and you can go to this building. And I think you do have to like pay periodically for materials and things like that, but you can go work in the club. And as long as you're a club member, you just have access to this. And they have classes and they have workshops. And I'm like, $50 a year, or maybe it was $100. I can't remember how much it was, but it was what we would essentially pay like half of a 6-week class here. So I thought, man, you guys have figured this out. And they were dotted everywhere. Like that's what I was doing, was traveling around teaching in these different small places. And towns we wouldn't necessarily think to put one, there was one. And that was one of the, larger activities in that area, which I thought, what a brilliant way to get people engaged. Because it wasn't about making money. It was about being a part of a club, like being a part of a group activity. So I thought about it almost more like a mental health thing. Now, granted, there were some serious artists that worked there, but some people just did it because that fulfilled them, which I thought was interesting.
But we have freedom, Ben. I couldn't help it. It's going to open a hole. We're not going to go down that route. We're going to stay in our lane and talk about pottery, but I just couldn't help it. No, it sounds more like a community center that would have other activities also, or like your rec league softball and different things like that. But so what does life look like for you now that I've rambled on for so long? Let's track back Ben Carter a little bit, because also let us not gloss over what you've been glossing over for months now, which is the Tales of the Red Clay Rambler, which is your podcast, has been around for 10 years.
That's correct.
Kind of a big number. It's kind of an important number that you haven't really fully celebrated.
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up. It has been 10 years, and it's funny. I spend so much time talking to other people, and I think I'm more comfortable putting the focus on other people. So when the 10-year anniversary came, it was actually back in May, and we had our first like celebration of it in July. At the end of July, we did a live episode to celebrate. So it just took me a couple months to be like, yeah, this is a big deal. I got to like get organized and, do something about it. But back to your original question, what my life looks like now is totally different than 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, I was running an art center in Shanghai, teaching classes, and we had not resident artists, but like people that would come in and work in a non-class basis. And I was, running the center, started the podcast, and then was making my work and shipping it back home to show or sell or whatever. And then when I came back home, back to the States, I started doing tons of workshops. And I really did that up until the pandemic. I was doing, a slow year would be 4 or 5, and a heavy year would be like 20 or 25. So I was traveling a ton. And then the pandemic happened and all that stopped, as you probably experienced too. Like the thirst for traveling just wasn't there. So all the workshops stopped. But at that same time, that's when the Brickyard Network started. So I started doing podcasting full time, developing podcasts for the Archie Bray Foundation for this network that we started. And so now my life kind of post-pandemic, or I don't know if we're post-pandemic, in the pandemic, whatever stage we're in.
Somebody needs to come up with a new name, because I keep having this same problem. And I'm like, we're here. That's where we are.
So here, as I am now, being a podcast producer is how I spend most of my time. And now I'm making pots at night after, I take care of my daughter and my wife and, all the normal stuff of life. So
you're just not sleeping, is what I'm hearing.
Basically. Yes.
Well, you look great for not sleeping.
Thanks. I appreciate it. But yeah, it's been a roller coaster over the last decade of what do I want to spend my time on, and then what actually makes money. Because those have never linked together for me. The things that I want to spend my time on have never been the most profitable. So I've kind of had to evolve into the next iteration of my creativity to just figure out, like, how do we make ends meet? Like in the pandemic, if I couldn't go out and teach workshops, I could have gone digital, but I didn't want to teach through the digital interface. So I really just did podcasting more. I'm much more comfortable with audio than video, I think, is why I didn't do that.
That's really interesting. And raises the great point of what I think a lot of people don't realize when they're thinking about becoming self-employed, for example, is just how much you constantly have to be iterating, right? Like you really have, I don't want to say have to, because if somebody will have an example of their own personal experience that will be counter to what I'm about to say. So in my experience, for my experience of being self-employed, like the drive and the interest to constantly keep learning new skills, I think has contributed to keeping this thing afloat for 12 years. Because if you're envisioning a world where, like, okay, I'm just going to learn how to do steps 1, 2, and 3, and then I can go sit in my quintessential potter shed and do those things and do nothing else, and I'll post to Instagram once a day because that's what you're supposed to do, and that's it, and that'll grow, and I'll sell pots, and that's fine. It's like, no. And that's part of what makes it exciting, because you're using so much of your brain all the time. I used to say this to people all the time, is that the exciting thing for me of being self-employed is that I'm not a cog in a wheel. You know, I'm not doing the same thing every single day. I'm constantly having to think critically and iterate and investigate and all the 8s apparently. And that's also what makes it exhausting. And that's what also leads people to burnout. And, you know, I'd be lying if I didn't say once every couple of years, I look at my friends who are traditionally employed and go, did I do the right thing? Like, then you really can't start talking about 401ks, because then it gets really depressing.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Scut is a proud sponsor of the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler. Scut Ceramic Products has been in manufacturing equipment for potters since 1953. Their reputation as a pioneer in innovative kiln design continues with the 4th generation of this family-owned business. Their KilnMaster touchscreen controller offers a sleek, smartphone-like interface that is both intuitive and packed with powerful tools that allow potters to easily program, diagnose, and remotely monitor their kilns. With 5 dedicated kiln technicians on staff and the most comprehensive network of distributors across the globe, you can be assured that Scut will be there for you before and after the sale. For more information on their line of kilns, visit scut.com. This episode of the podcast is also sponsored by Amico Brent. For the past 100 years, Amico Brent has been creating ceramic supplies for our community, ranging from underglazes to electric kilns. With over 3,000 products, Amico Brent's top priority is making sure that all of their customer needs are met. From the professional to the student and everyone in between, their high-quality materials enable you to make your best work. To learn more, check them out at amico.com or on Instagram and Facebook at Amico Brent. You can also show them how you use Amico by sharing your work online with the hashtag HowIAmico. What I want to go back to what you said about you, and you graduated 2009, right? Mm-hmm. So Great Recession is kicking off or going strong. You moved to England. I finished grad school 2010, and I moved to China. And I don't think I don't think that's a coincidence. Like, for our generation, it was a sink or swim moment, and a lot of us left the country. And the skills that I learned in China in terms of going with the flow, and I'm sure with you in England too, like, you learn to just accept and problem solve in the moment in a way that's different than I think if you go into corporate America, where your problem solving is the corporation gives you very strict boundary. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I wonder how we've been affected by that, because this is my theory, but I bet you that both of us are good in crisis because we've been in crisis in other countries, and you just learn to it's not a crisis, like something weird's happening, but it's fine. And that is a small business skill that pays dividends over and over and over again.
I've never thought about that. That's really interesting. In hindsight, when I think about my time in the UK, it's all rose-colored glasses, right? It's like, for the first time in my life, I was blending this world of social justice that I had become incredibly passionate about in college with arts, and that it wasn't, I wasn't just making stuff because it was pretty. It was working with at-risk 8 to 12-year-olds, and those two worlds were finally blended together, which was just magical to me. My mom would probably have another opinion because apparently some of my emails were possibly laden with homesickness. I don't remember it, but who knows? I'm sure multiple things can be true at once. So that's a really, I've never thought about it, but I'm sure. Absolutely. I mean, or at least risk tolerance, I would say. That would be I continue to identify myself as very risk intolerant, and avoiding it. But, I also traveled around the world by myself for a year, and people would probably call that pretty comfortable with risk, especially as a 23-year-old American girl. Pretty sure there's some movies about that.
Sure. Some don't end very well. So hopefully we watch the good ones.
Yeah, I know. We just didn't watch them. I actually think Taken, the very, very first Taken, came out in 2010 when I was abroad.
Wow.
So pretty sure people hid that from family, loved ones that would have pulled me off the plane. But, and a broke 20-something. So you're not always making the wisest of travel choices. You're making the monetary choices. And, would I take a bus from England to Belgium again by myself overnight? Probably not.
There were so many times when I was on public transportation leaving Shanghai, and you're leaving this massive, massive city going out into the country. And for me, I always those adventures. We went to Yixing, which is a pottery village that makes this very specific type of teapot. You've probably seen them. They're raw. They look raw. They're brown. They're very small. They're actually hand built, but they look like slip cast or thrown. They're really beautifully made. And leaving Shanghai to go there on a bus, is some of the calmest. I love traveling. Some of my calmest moments are en route somewhere because I'm just settling into the new reality of wherever I'm going, and I miss that. The pandemic kind of cut me off from that. And I really was at home for the first time in my adult life for 2 years in a row. And it was this weird feeling of being stranded, but at home. So I had to learn to travel through podcasting as opposed through taking my body somewhere else. Even though I'd been podcasting for a while, it became necessary that I talk to other people in other places to get that fix,
Oh, that's interesting. I have a funny question and then a serious question. First, the funny question. Do you have a very difficult time traveling with other people?
It's funny. My wife and I are so joined at the hip. We don't have a problem anymore, but yes, with other people.
Yep. I get very frustrated, let's put it, very quickly in large groups being more than 6. I can
impossible.
Do 4. Mm-hmm. But because I traveled by myself, what I loved so much was just no one's going to believe me, the words that are about to come out of my mouth. Everyone is going to have thoughts to say. I'm quiet when I travel by myself. No one believes this because I want to blend in, because I know if I open my mouth, all of a sudden, then you are the American. And obviously, I'm sure you traveling through Shanghai stick out as the American, but me traveling through Western Europe, I can blend in a little bit and pull out my Mediterranean roots. And so it really was a much more introspective time, and also kind of just experiencing culture instead of doing the touristy things, because I was abroad for so long. It wasn't okay, I'm going to go to Paris and go up to the top of the Eiffel Tower because this is my one trip to Paris ever. Like, you know, you can fly from England to Paris for like $40. Let's not dwell on that. You know, and so it was like almost like a different side that I don't typically sit with for myself. So it's interesting because it seems like when you were stuck at home, that was like the flip side of personality instead of the reverse for me. But more seriously, I want to hear more about Shanghai and how that, I mean, so when you did your master's in ceramics?
I did.
So was the thought always to teach? Was it the plan, or was it just kind of like, because as you were saying, in 2010, we were all kind of were like, well, what are we going to do now?
No, I had a plan, totally fictitious plan, but I had a plan that I was going to move overseas and work for a couple years. And then when I came back, that experience would propel me into a tenure track job, or maybe running another art center, you know, something in the arts. But what happened is that I met my wife and fell in love. And then that, you know, derailed in a positive way to where now I'm the trailing spouse. You know, like for me, she's going to have the more stable job. She's actually a historian of contemporary East Asia. So her position is more marketable in the academic world than mine was. So I've applied for some jobs in academia, but I kind of, you know, once we met and I started following her, I kind of gave up that dream, or evolved out of it, because I think it's just easier to rely on her for the health insurance than for me.
Well, and I mean, just logistically speaking, I would imagine it would be really difficult for you both to get tenure positions at universities within the same geographical location of each other. You know, like I can just see a multi-coastal world happening very quickly if you were, you know, dead set on those things.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And I see a lot of friends that have done that, where one has a tenure track job and then the other partner ends up adjuncting at like a whole host of universities around the area. And I could do that. Down in Philadelphia, there's quite a few schools, but there's a ton of competition for teaching there because it's a great clay city. There's a lot of really smart people that are part of that adjunct shuffle down there. So I've kind of just avoided that. And because of the podcast network, that's kind of replaced that dream.
So you were doing workshops how long were you in Shanghai?
I was there for 2.5 years.
Okay. So that's like 2012, 2013. And then you came back to the US. You met your wife in Shanghai?
I did. Yep.
And so then you guys came back and you were doing workshops around like private studios, private being not public schools, not university level, like community studios and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I've definitely taught and lectured at universities, but the majority, I'd say probably at least 70% of the workshops are independent art centers. And surprisingly enough, they pay way better than universities, which is so interesting.
Or not surprising. I briefly mentioned to Matt, Kat, so I recently did this is like a small humble brag. I recently spoke at Harvard.
Nice.
virtually through their like community clay center there. I'm probably messing up how. Yes, Kathy. Well, so Kathy emailed me, but there was Natalie. Oh gosh, what's Natalie? It starts with an R. Natalie's Rolstein. Oh shoot, sorry, Natalie. We'll link it in the show notes. Anyway, she had listened to the webinar that I did on Instagram photography mistakes and got the cheat sheet that we have on our email and stuff. I send out a free photo tip email once a month to people on our list. And so invited me to speak to her class, which was amazing. And I had mentioned because at first when I got the email from Kathy, I had just interviewed Matt on the podcast. So I thought it was a very like gracious connection there. And she was like, nope, that wasn't it at all. It was through Natalie. And I was like, well, that's cool. But Matt and I were talking about kind of higher ed and teaching because I've always been interested. Not always. I mean, not when I was born. Having gone through the progression that I went through out of school into entrepreneurship, I've always had an interest in going back into schools and talking about professional practices in terms of like because there's so many people now coming up in university realizing odds are you're going to be self-employed. And kind of have played around with the idea of like, could I get an adjunct job? How does it work? Looking at it going, why would I go into tens of thousands of dollars of debt to get a master's to then like the pay of adjunct and, just getting, in my brain, having this chip on my shoulder of having never officially had a job. It's not like I worked for somebody and then quit and started my own or anything. Feeling like I still needed that recognition, justification, whatever it is, that acknowledgement of the traditional world and of higher ed to like have some security. And then in talking to Matt, realizing, oh no, we can build way more security on our own than what higher ed provides. And just realizing like the things that we're taught to perceive as the secure routes are really just more limiting. Like they're not necessarily more secure.
And it's about fitting your experience into their mold, whether that's the corporation, the university, the whatever, as to where if you create your own thing, you're creating the mold. So you just create whatever is the most comfortable for you. And Matt is a great example. Matt and Rose have built Ceramic Materials Workshop out of his lecturing and her working also. They've worked for universities and still do at other times, but they realize like, wait, we can just form a network of ceramic material education classes and almost I haven't actually asked him, but it appears almost instantly they filled up. Like people loved them. Their classes fill like amazingly well. So there's a demand for being yourself, which I think is another way to think about it when you're building a platform for education. Because if you need the education, more than likely someone else will too. So if you build the system, educate yourself, other people can use that system.
Yep, absolutely. I have no segue from that.
Well, I have a segue. This is good.
Right.
We're gonna go back and forth. So
go.
You've now opened something called the Community, which is a conscious digital community for small business owners, many of which are ceramic. I guess they're not all ceramic, right? It's a little bit of everything.
There's a couple other makers in there. It's definitely heavy on ceramicists just because that's the world I speak to so much. But there's definitely other makers in there and it's open to anyone. But essentially it was about providing a space much like I experienced coming out of that conference 12 years ago, and being able to go to conferences, COVID notwithstanding, is a luxury, right? They're cost prohibitive. You've got to be able to, oftentimes you're traveling halfway across the country, if not halfway across the world, depending on where you live. There are these pockets of places through the world, I think, that have really amazing community opportunities, like the ladies at the Village Potters in Asheville, North Carolina. I mean, sign me up, please. But I'm in Milwaukee and they're in Asheville. Every winter I wonder why I'm not in Asheville, but that's a different thing. But, there's potters all over the world now. And I think having a studio at home is becoming increasingly popular, especially with community studios shutting down in COVID. And yet you still need that support. You still need to chat with people who understand what you're struggling with in a way that your best friend might not. That was always the big thing of showing up to conferences, was like you were in a room of people that just get it. That like you don't have to explain why centering is difficult. You don't have to explain, how confusing setting up shipping is, the way that like even your best friend supports you, they're just not going to get it. At the same time, wanting to have the digital platform in order to have a much more diverse group of voices, because conferences being cost prohibitive sometimes are going to attract certain groups. As much as people might be learning to be better about being intentional, about being available and open to all sorts of people from around the world and diversity and providing scholarships for socioeconomic reasons, et cetera, like just by nature, if you're traditionally employed in the US, you get 2 weeks PTO, paid time off, and you want to go to a conference for 4 days. Well, now are you going to not take off for Christmas? Like, you know, like how's that going to work? As an example. So yeah, so seeing the benefit of having a digital space where we could bring people from all over the world, which we do have a pretty solid representation right now, which is exciting. To have that like-mindedness, but also be able to help challenge each other and have what I hope to be, I'm always actively working on, be a safe space for, you know, being vulnerable, but also being challenged a little bit in terms of like, hey, we support you, but maybe what if like I had this other experience with the same topic? So does that help either one of us come at a problem from the a different perspective than we would have otherwise thought? Or I don't have a really good elevator pitch for the community yet, clearly, because it's so exciting. And I feel like there are so many opportunities for a lot of depth that I don't have it into a little 30-second pitch.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I mean, what you said that makes sense is that you're trying to get a diversity of experience and be able to have access to that from wherever you're at globally. So one of the things though about communities like this is that they often can start really strong and then kind of peter out. And one of the things you're doing that I really like is that you have monthly topics. So you're kind of drawing people like, no, pay attention, you know, like focus on this. I can't remember what the topics were, but like what is this month's topic that people are focused on?
This last month has been about shipping and packaging, which has been, and also I will say it's not just topics that I can then sit and preach on, right? Like there are not weekly lessons or classes or homework. Like I'm a member on the same way that everybody else is. If I do have particular experience with a topic that everybody picks to have as a monthly theme, then I'll chime in a little bit more, or sometimes we'll do live calls. We're figuring out right now how to work the technology of the system the platform's hosted on to do live calls that are not just me live, but instead everybody, like a Google Meet type of thing. So that's coming soon, hopefully. But, you know, wanting it to be the way I describe it is like a cocktail party, not a lecture hall, you know, so it's not just a platform there for me to teach. Like I have my courses. If you want that, awesome. That's a different thing. But yeah, so this last month was shipping and packaging, I should say. We kicked it off with a month on Instagram. We probably could have had 6 more months of discussion, and the discussions don't close, right? They're themes to help us like have constructive conversation, but you can always keep having those conversations. They don't like shut down, you know, it's structurally speaking, as far as the technology, it is similar to a Facebook group in terms of like you can navigate through topics and you can search and you can DM people. It is not on Facebook. That was a big thing for me. And so because also the other reason I wanted to do those monthly themes was not just to keep people engaged, but because what I struggled with so much when I first was starting, and frankly, really only got really good at in the last maybe 4 years, 3 if I'm being more realistic, was staying focused on one thing at a time. I think that is kind of to be dramatic about it, to be a silent killer for so many of us, whether you're side hustling, whether you're fully self-employed, whatever it is. When we start to get pulled in all these different directions, the analogy I had a coach of mine tell me once was, imagine that you are at the bottom of a hill and you are trying to push something up the hill. If somebody dumps a bucket of pebbles from the top of the hill down, and your job is to push all of the pebbles up, you're not going to get anywhere, right? Because your hands, nobody can see me, but your hands are moving left, right, sideways, up, down to try and catch all these pebbles at once. And so inevitably things fall through the crack and you literally don't move forward at all. Whereas if you have a boulder at the bottom of the hill, yes, it's very difficult to get going, but if all your strength and all your effort is laser focused on that one thing, you can probably start to get a little momentum of it, and you can at least get halfway up the hill instead of still staying at the bottom. And that analogy for me, when I had a coach say that, was like, oh.
And I think the community in your case and other support groups online or anywhere in person too, having someone at your back helping you push that boulder is even better. Because then, or even if they're not pushing, even if they're saying you can do it, stay focused, keep going, you can do it. Like
watch out, there's a hole, go to your left.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor. They can see what we often can't.
Well, and in there we have, let's see, Bill's been like a full-time maker for a couple of decades. And then at the same time, you've got Jess and Kat who are side hustling and, debating about like maybe someday they'll go full-time, maybe they won't, who knows. We've got people from all of those different levels as well, both in age, literally, and in age of making, if you will, to really bring a lot of those perspectives too. Yeah, it's awesome. It's a great space.
Yeah. Well, how can people see that? Like, how can people check that out?
Totally. You can just go to makersplaybook.com/community. And that will be like an info page to where you can read all about what we're talking about here. And then there's a button to click and check it out. It is a paid membership, I should say, but I did figure out the technology to offer a 2-week free trial. So we're like full on Netflix now. But there is for people who are, because we do want to make sure this is a diverse crowd of people and internationally speaking, one of the big things before I launched was figuring out how to make it actually equitable, not equal, but equitable. And so I went down a very long rabbit hole of lots of financial jargon, of which I'm going to mess up the names of the terminology because I don't have it in front of me. But essentially there is this equation that they do to look at the difference in currencies throughout the world, and then there is a list of countries that are under a certain bracket, and some of this has been like dubbed like the McDonald's study or something. I don't remember what like the cost of a cheeseburger in every country or whatever, because just accounting for currency exchange doesn't necessarily account for cost of living.
And buying power. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And so this isn't an automated thing. There's more info on that on the page on the website, which is the makersplaybook.com/community. So that's handy to go for the info first. But essentially, if you're living in a country that is on this list of places, I have an adjusted rate for people so that, we can just acknowledge reality that something in the US that's $27 a month is maybe not a big deal here compared to Trinidad and Tobago or South Africa or wherever else, myriad of Thailand, Philippines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the currently most sustainable way to be able to stay in alignment with that piece for us. And then every single month we look at the membership, and I get a little report from the system. And as a group, we are taking 10% of that membership cost and donating it to different groups that are helping bring about more equity in the arts world. So our first month was for the Kabu Clay Collective.
Nice.
Which is awesome. And we've got another one of our members is in the UK, and there's a center there that she let us know about. That's was the second month donation. And then there's a few others that I've got on my radar for the future, but we'll see what people suggest too, because I'm not calling all the shots on this one.
Well, I have one last question, but I realized that would be 2 questions in a row. So do you have a last question for me before we wrap up?
Oh, gosh. So much pressure. It's so much harder being on this side of the mic. This is why we interview people. I've been sweating this whole time. I have so many. I have notes. So let's do your last question first, and then we're going to lean heavy on the Ben Carter side of things.
Okay, sure. So you have a quality, which I think of, this is a weird term, but sneaky intimacy, which is where you can connect to people quickly. And my theory is that this is part of being a wedding photographer, that you had to be able to read the room and be able to have them be comfortable in front of you relatively quickly, like within, I don't know, the first 15 minutes or something. Mm-hmm. Podcasting is the same way. and I've experienced this by talking to you off the mic. Like within a couple minutes, I feel like I know her, So what do you think the qualities of this, like how do you do that?
Well, thank you. I can't say that it's conscious. I am the youngest cousin of a very big extended family. So I'm sure part of it has been always trying to fit in with my older cousins so that they would let me tag along less often than I like. Thank you very much. But I would agree that definitely for me in wedding photography, making sure people were comfortable is always paramount. That's not necessarily the case throughout the industry, and that's definitely kind of my stake in the ground. Many times from experience of just working with other photographers over the year, I was, you'd have very beautiful women who were used to being on camera, models in front of you who were clearly uncomfortable and uncertain if they were doing the right thing. And it was like, because the person behind the camera was so focused on the camera, it was like, you just gotta tell her she looks great while you push the shutter button. It does wonders. Like it's so that part of it with the photography side is for me is just kind of common sense, but definitely not often thought of.
So don't let the camera get in the way of the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for me, it was always, I need to know that I can use this piece of equipment intuitively enough, without it taking up so much brain space that I can't have space left to talk to people. Right. Because I think that really is more so for some people is like they get so wrapped up in the gear and making sure they're taking a well-exposed photo or whatever it is that they don't have any space left to keep that conversation going. And maybe it was because, when I first started, so the way I started my business is I worked two part-time jobs on the side. I didn't take out any business loans. It's ironic that my 10-year in business was 2020. And so that's the first time I took out a business loan. I was like, not how I plan to celebrate 10 years. But so I worked as a barista in the beginning for part of that time. And you have to, you will lose I was downtown Chicago during morning rush hour. You have to be able to hold a conversation with a regular that you see every single day while you're making 3 other orders and making sure that the next batch of coffee isn't going to be, you've got to refill it before it's empty. Otherwise, you've got to tell somebody that they've got to wait 10 minutes and they're not having that. So I don't know if it's from there. I don't know. I'm sure it's a emergence of all of these things, and a therapist could have a field day.
Well, you said something about the camera that I think is equivalent to the microphone. Like if you have to intuitively approach a microphone in podcasting in the same way you do a camera, or you'll be afraid of it. And when I'm teaching people to podcast through the Brickyard Network, one of the things we work on is that you put the microphone low enough so that you're looking at the person, not the microphone, which is the most simple tool ever. But if you look at a microphone and you're new to this, you'll freak yourself out. You're like, oh, I'm talking in a microphone. It's like, no, you're talking to a person through a microphone. That's different.
Yeah. And I didn't even think of that. I get really anxious at the start of my interviews when I'm trying to set up the tech, because I'm aware of each second clicking by that the person on the other side is sitting there waiting or wondering if they're doing something wrong or why isn't it working. And it's like, no, it's not you. Don't worry. Like it's, and so there have been times where I'll just start an interview before I know whether or not the audio is actually really good, because I don't want to make that person uncomfortable, which is in complete service of keeping our guests comfortable, and sometimes in complete disservice of, is it actually going to sound good at the end so that we can publish it?
This has been fun.
Absolutely. We should do this more often. We got to get Carol now on this.
Well, this is a good time to talk about it. I hope you'll come to NCECA this year, because we're going to try to do a think tank for podcasters. I've been talking to Paula about this, where some of it will be talking about technology, like what's the best practices for all the stuff that we do. But that's going to happen this year at the Cincinnati NCECA. So if you're there, I'd love for you to be a part of that.
Good to know. That would be fantastic. Yeah, hopefully it definitely is on the radar and on the we took note of the dates. Last year we would have loved to come, but that was right when we were coming back from Italy. So, after 2 years of not being able to go back and having never met my in-laws in person, we kind of had to prioritize that one.
Definitely. For the listeners, we're going to have a lot of live episode tapings during NCECA this year. We're working with NCECA to get a room. So potentially you could have a live taping of the Maker's Playbook. This is assuming we can find the right venue. But hopefully your listeners will keep an eye out so you could have a live episode there as well.
Oh man, that first we got to have the conversation about technology, and then I will say yes to a live taping.
Well, I'll do the taping, you do the talking, and you pick the guest, and we'll take care of it.
That we can do. Maybe that'll be the first time we can actually get Francesco on a recording.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Peer pressure. Awesome. Ben, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yes, you as well. It's been a pleasure to connect.
I don't know how to end just as much as I don't know how to begin. People just come for the middle.
Yes. Cool. Sounds
awesome.
Good.
You started this, so you have to stop the recording.
I'd like to thank Rebecca for coming on the show. I think you could hear that we had a lot of fun talking back and forth about podcasting as well as our businesses. If you'd like to hear the second part of this interview, we talk about the formation of the Brickyard Podcast Network, as well as home buying and having kids and all sorts of other stuff. That's going to be airing on the Maker's Playbook feed later in the week, so make sure to check that out. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors, the Michiana Pottery Tour, Amico Brent, and Scut Ceramic Products for their sponsorship. Without their generous support, we couldn't make this show or any of the ones on the Brickyard Podcast Network. So if you're interested in sponsoring an episode, get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities whose lands we reside on in the United States, and recognize that we are uninvited guests on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of over 500 nations indigenous to North America. By acknowledging and reflecting upon the contemporary lived experiences and histories of the Indigenous peoples here and globally, we may begin to take essential steps towards creating a more equitable world. Learn more through the hashtag Honor Native Land initiative of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and consider contributing to Indigenous-led organizations doing important work to further health and wellness, sovereignty, and self-determination of the first people of the lands you reside. This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.